Well, the title of the message this morning is Invitation to a Better Story. That might make a little more sense if you were here last week and were part of our reflection on what I called longing for a better story. We talked last week somewhat about the struggles of life and just the world around us, whether it's struggles in our own lives that maybe did not turn out the way that we would have wished, or things that we would have written differently if we had the chance to go back, or things in the world around us, just the chaos, the anger, the hostility, the hatred, so much brokenness in the world, and that there's often when we quiet ourselves and stop to reflect, there is often deep within us a longing for, if not a different story or a better story, at the very least for a better ending than what we can foresee right now. Somehow for the story of our individual lives, for the story of humanity to make sense in some ways that often in the midst of struggle it doesn't seem to make sense. You say, well, what does that have to do with Christmas? Well, that's the context for Christmas. As we often talk about how Christmas is celebrated in the midst of the darkest time of the year. And somehow against the backdrop of that darkness, the light represented in the coming of Christ is all the more meaningful as we realize our desperate need for it. And so the good news is that if you're among those who at times have become aware of this deep longing within you for a better story, the good news is that today we're going to talk about an invitation. It's always nice to get an invitation, right? You open it up, something's happening, there's an event, and you're invited. Well, there's an invitation extended to us to be part of a bigger story, to be part of a better story. Your name's on the invitation, and there's a place in that story for you. A way that you can contribute meaningfully to that story. And there is purpose, and there is meaning. And there is promise of a better ending. But it's not only about the ending, it's about here and now too. It's interesting how this whole concept is illustrated so powerfully in a lot of literature and in popular movies today, and I don't know that's new today. We could probably go back through literature of generations ago and find some similar themes. I just want to speak to a couple of movies or stories that have particularly spoken to me that illustrate this concept. Each one of them is a little different, but the themes are similar of people perhaps going through their ordinary lives and then somehow being caught up into a bigger, better story. In some cases, perhaps they were very happy in their ordinary lives. Sometimes that's us. In other cases, we're very aware of how broken our stories are, and we long for something different. I think of the C.S. Lewis children's Narnia series and The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and how these young children really aren't looking. In fact, they stumble into a whole other story, a whole other world, the land of Narnia. They enter it through a wardrobe. The little girl, Lucy, was just going to hide in a game of hide and seek. In the midst of their children's game, this door opens into a whole new world that they never knew existed. And in the process, there's a place in that whole new world. There are roles for them to play, and they end up participating in a whole different story and playing a very significant part in that story, and in the process, their lives are changed. Now, there was still some choice involved. Once they discovered this land of Narnia, once they stumbled into that world, whether they would step up to the opportunities that were offered to them. Think of another story written by someone who was a friend of C.S. Lewis's, as I understand. A series of stories. There's The Hobbit. And then there's The Lord of the Rings, written in 3 books by a man named Tolkien. Once again, seemingly little people in this particular set of stories, literally little people, hobbits. They're kind of a race. They're human-like. We might even say they are human, but small of stature and seemingly insignificant. Their desire is typically just to live in peace and away from all the hustle and bustle of the world. They don't want to be bothered by all those things. They just want to live simply and peacefully and away from everything else. And it was a couple of these hobbits. Bilbo in the story of The Hobbit, and Frodo in the story of The Lord of the Rings. Don't really want to be bothered, but get invited into a bigger story. Because the entirety of Middle Earth is under threat, unlike anything that they've ever known before. But what can a little hobbit do? Well, that's part of the story. And looked up this one quote when Bilbo in the first book, The Hobbit, is first approached with a task that he's needed for. Gandalf comes to him and presents this adventure. And here's his response. Sorry, I don't want any adventures, thank you. Not today. Good morning. But please come to tea anytime you like. Why not tomorrow? Goodbye. No adventures for me. I'm happy. I'm content. My world is fine, thank you. You relate to that sometimes? Yeah, we might. So what's all this talk about longing for a better story? Mine's pretty good. I like my story. I'm comfortable. Open your eyes. Open your hearts. The world's a mess. The world is broken. And the invitation comes to enter another story, to enter a bigger story, to be part of something that matters. There's that moment later on in The Lord of the Rings, first book, Fellowship, where Frodo has done his bit of task that he thought was the only thing he was going to be asked to do, and then he finds out just what all is at stake and what really needs to happen. And how this ring needs to be destroyed, and the journey is treacherous and almost impossible, and chances are it will never succeed, but it's the only way. And while these bigger and mightier people are arguing over things and who's supposed to do it and how they're supposed to destroy it, this little hobbit speaks up and says, I will go, but I don't know the way. Maybe that's us, or should be us. We look at the world and the mess that it's in. God's invitation for his people to stand up is, no matter how small we may feel, say, I'll do something. I'll volunteer, but I don't know the way. I have no clue what to do. I have no clue to how to fix anything, how to make it right, but I'm available. I'll do what I can. And sometimes it's out of those small beginnings that heroes are made, and that worlds are changed or saved. Other popular stories with some similar themes. The Harry Potter series, whatever you think of that, it's a fascinating story and plot lines, and once again, a small person destined to make a big difference in the clashes of good and evil. They're the Hunger Games. The last movie just came out. The hero of that story, the heroine, Katniss, wasn't exactly chosen. The circumstances, the setting of that whole series was forced upon them, but it was her younger sister who was chosen, who would most certainly be killed, and Katniss volunteers to take her place, assuming that she would likely lose her life in the process. And she ends up being the heroine of that series of stories. See, the invitation comes to us in different ways. Sometimes we stumble into it. Sometimes it's in a sense thrust upon us. And for some, they go looking for it, looking for their place in that bigger story. You know, Jesus told a parable once that kind of summarizes how we come into God's bigger story. There's actually two parables, and I've shared this a number of times. They're seemingly insignificant parables. They don't really even tell much of a story. One is about a man who apparently was on a journey somewhere else. He was going through a field, and he kind of stumbled upon a treasure in the field. He wasn't looking for it, apparently. We don't know the details, but he finds this treasure, and the field doesn't belong to him, so the treasure doesn't belong to him. But he goes and he gives up everything else in order to buy this field so that he can obtain this treasure. So what's the meaning of that? Well, hold on. We'll look at the second one, and then together I think they have even greater meaning. The second one right next to it is a man who is on a mission. He's a merchant. He's a collector of pearls, and he's looking for that one rarest pearl, the most valuable of all. And when he finally finds it, he sells all the others. He gets rid of everything else, gives it all up that he might purchase and obtain this pearl. See, I think the meaning of those is found in seeing where they're alike and where they're different. Where they're alike is each one of those men finds a treasure that suddenly gives great meaning to them. Understand, the lesson of those parables is not riches give meaning. Okay? Nobody's gone that direction. It's understanding the stories and what it represents. So in each case, they found what was of value, and they do whatever it takes to obtain that. The difference is the one man apparently was not looking, and the other man was looking. I believe the interpretation of those parables is that the treasure in each case, whether it was the treasure in the field or the pearl of great price, represented the kingdom of God, represented God's bigger story. And their eyes were open to that, and they wanted to become a part of that. And some of us, perhaps, motivated by this deep longing, this deep sense that something is wrong in the world, and we're aware of that, and we have this deep hunger, and we search, and God is found by us. That's how some come into the story. Perhaps more come in, I wasn't even looking. And somehow on my road to somewhere else, God showed up, interrupted my life, and now I can't go back. I can't now unknow what I know. I can't unsee what I've seen, and God has revealed himself to me in some way. And yes, I have a choice, but sometimes it might feel like I don't have a choice, because it's true and it's real. You say, well, you're talking in all of these analogies, abstract language. What are we talking about being part of another story? I want to suggest that there's meaning and purpose to existence, that there's meaning and purpose to human history, even moving in a line chronologically, linearly, that there is meaning and purpose. And we may not always recognize that we're in the midst of it, but there are times when all we can see is the trees, and we've lost sense of the forest. And when we're talking about God's story, we're talking about the whole forest, the whole landscape. and the opportunity to be a tree in that landscape, if you will. You say, well, what's one tree in the forest? Well, it's one tree in the forest. You might take one tree out and you might step back and see the forest and not notice it, but how many trees do you have to take before all of a sudden the whole forest changes? And there are ways that each tree does contribute to the forest. I want to suggest that when we come into alignment with God's story, that there are some things that change. Maybe not everything. Certainly our perspective changes. Even if only I'm a tree in the forest and now I know that I'm not by myself. I'm surrounded by other trees and together we make up the forest. Even if it's just an awareness of the story, and my part may not change drastically, my path may not change drastically, but now suddenly my perspective has changed, and I realize that what I do every day of my life is not just this hamster wheel going round and round, but no, there is meaning and purpose, and there is a God who is ordering this universe, and there is a God who will use what I do every day as part of his greater story. Not only does my perspective change, my pursuits change. And suddenly what I'm doing every day of my life is not for the goal of simply accumulating things or wealth or security or peace. It's not just about me. Suddenly I come to understand God's story and understand God's purposes. And suddenly everything that I do now, I'm pursuing other goals. And I'm working not just to get an income, but I'm working to use my gifts or my abilities to provide for my family, to have money to give. I'm working to be able to build relationships with other people. I'm working to be used by God wherever I am to make a difference in the story for good. Entering God's story always changes our perspective, always changes our pursuits. Sometimes it changes our path. Those are the stories that we especially are inspired by, where someone's life is entirely redirected and they're in a sense raised from obscurity and in this prominent position where their courage, where their faithfulness makes a big difference. But understand, for every hero in those stories, for every Frodo, there's a Sam, a companion giving him encouragement to finish, to stay true to the course. And so many other people who are playing their roles, seemingly insignificant, but are also part of the story. See, God has invited us into a bigger, better story, and Christmas is the time we kind of celebrate that story. The scriptures from John chapter 1, it's interesting. There's kind of this play back and forth, because what is especially marvelous and miraculous about Christmas and about that story is that God entered our story. John 1:14, the Word became flesh and made his home here among us. That's the miracle of Christmas, is the God who created it all entered his creation and became one of us. But in the process of God entering our story, he pulls back the veil and opens our eyes to, no, wait a minute. It's not really our story after all, because the God who entered our story is the Word who was from the beginning. It's not our story. It's his story. He's the one who has always been. He's the one who created all things. And we were content just to marvel that God came into our story. And then we find out it's not our story. He came in to invite us into his bigger story, to partner with him in being channels of love and grace in this dark and broken world. The traditional Christmas story, as we understand it, is filled with invitations. We've talked about movies. Let's think just for our last few moments this morning about some of the characters in the Christmas stories. Think about Zechariah and Elizabeth. That's where Luke starts the story. Were they young or old? Old. Very old. Past childbearing years. Zechariah was still serving as a priest in the temple. One day an angel showed up. Said, guess what? You're going to have a baby. No way. Well, that's what they said. Zechariah and Elizabeth had already aligned themselves with God's story. This was not brand new. This was not the first invitation. I mean, their whole life was centered around telling people about God and his story, perhaps never dreaming the role that they would come to play in it. They certainly seemed too old to have any significant part at this point, but they weren't. The baby that was born to Zechariah and Elizabeth was named John, the forerunner of the Messiah. We know him as John the Baptist. And then there was this young girl, Mary. She too had aligned herself with God's story. That's evident. You read in Luke chapter 1, you read of the song that she sings, a kind of a prayer after this angel comes, after that encounter happens. And obviously this is a woman who has devoted herself to God. And so the context of this angel visit saying to her, Mary, you've been chosen to be a lead in this part of the story. God was not a stranger to her, but she still had questions. How can this be? You say, I'm going to give born to the one who's going to be called the Son of God. How can this happen? I've never been with a man. And the angel says, God's got it planned. This is going to be unlike any other birth. And Mary responds, saying, I'm your servant. May it be as you say. I'll do whatever you ask of me. I'm sure at that point having no clue what all that would entail, as some of these others we've talked about in their stories. Mary seemed to have been too young for any significant part. She was likely still a teenager. So maybe there's a lesson in there as God extends his invitation to step up, to take our part. Can't use that excuse. I'm too young. I'm too old. God invites us into his story. I think of the shepherds. Not really a clear indication of whether they'd been previously aligned with God's story or not. And yet this opportunity came to them out of nowhere. The sky lit up, and there are these angels and this announcement of one who is born, who will change the world, who will bring peace. If you want it, the invitation's yours. You can go see. No charge. For these who are generally considered too poor and insignificant to be part of any meaningful story. But they were invited in too. The Magi, we don't know of their alignment either. They were scholars. But they were searching. They were looking for knowledge. They were looking for meaning. They were watching the skies. They were hungry to know more about what this world was all about. And that hunger drove them to the place where God allowed himself to be found by them, to be discovered, the signs that God had put in the skies. We don't know what all of that was about, how that came about, but somehow these men who were searching found the clues. They who could have been considered too rich and important to be bothered with any story but their own, they too found their way into this story. The next couple of weeks we're going to continue looking at what this means. We're going to look next week at what it means to be living in this story. To catch a glimpse both in the Christmas accounts and in our lives as well. Don't know where each of you are in relation to this. My assumption as we're a community of faith is that each of us at some point in our life has aligned ourselves with God's story, have said, yes, God, yes, I'll follow you, yes, I'll go where you want me to go, I'll do what you want me to do. And for some of us, maybe that's been years ago, and we're just kind of comfortable living in, yes, I'm part of that story, but maybe we've lost sight of how that relates to me. Maybe we've lost sight of that perspective. Maybe we've lost sight of those pursuits and we've gotten sidetracked with our own pursuits. And maybe we need to hear that invitation again, that reminder of God inviting us to not only mentally align ourselves with His story, but to be very willing and say, okay, God, what does that mean for me today? How would you use me in your story today, and this week, and this year? It may not be in any way that ever gets headlines here. That's not really the point of it. It's about a new perspective. It's about new pursuits. And whether it ever changes our path or not, it's being part of something that matters. Reminded of that little, it's not exactly a poem, it kind of sounds like it, that talks about the relative importance of something that might seem very minute. I'll start it and you'll probably be able to finish it if you'd like, but talks about a battle. It starts with talking about a nail. It says, for want of a nail, a shoe, like a horseshoe. For want of a nail, a shoe was lost. For want of a shoe, a horse was lost. For want of a horse, a soldier was lost. And for want of a soldier, a battle was lost. For want of a battle, the war was lost. All for the want of a horseshoe nail. The blacksmith who made the nails, not a very glamorous job, is it? But you can see what a nail provides in its context as part of a bigger story. And we're invited to be part of a story with far, far greater significance than any earthly battle that has ever happened. May God help us to open our eyes, open our hearts to that bigger perspective, to those deeper pursuits, and to find and own and step into our place in that story. Many of you have done that and are continuing to do that, not just in big things, but to know that small things done in the name of Christ, small things done in the character of Christ, can make a big difference.